Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to Teagasc, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you the latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode we're switching to a health focus. I'm joined by Dr Orla Keane from the Animal Bioscience Centre in Teagasc Grange, who's going to discuss the whole area of parasite control in lambs in the main part of the grazing season and some of the challenges that we face in the sector. I'm joined today by Dr Orla Keane, based in Teagasc Grange. Orla covers many aspects of research in Teagasc, but one key area of interest is the whole control of parasites and ruminants in cattle and sheep. I suppose today, Orla, thanks for joining us firstly. We might focus on parasite control in sheep.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of the grazing season at the moment, and we might just start off by maybe explaining to our listeners what are the key parasite challenges from this time of the year on.
Okay, so at this time of the year, the risk period for Coccidia nematodiris has passed. So what you're looking at is the main worms of concern are Telodorsagia, which is the brown stomach worm, and Trichostrongylus, the black scour worm. So they are the kind of parasites that you'd be concerned about in mid-season. They're all stomach worms.
And I suppose, probably an obvious question, but one there's no harm in experience. Why are we actually treating lambs for a parasite challenge?
Yeah, so high numbers of parasites in the gut can cause damage. So the first thing that they will do is that they'll reduce the feed intake of the lamb, and that will obviously impact its performance down the line. Also, when they get to high numbers, they can damage the gut, and that'll limit the ability of the animal to absorb nutrients. And again, that will affect the performance of the animal. But it is important to remember that these worms do damage at high levels. So we do need kind of the animals to develop their own natural immunity to worms. So what you want them to get is a low level of infection that allows them to develop immunity, but not so high that it impacts the performance.
So it's getting the balance right between not having long-term effects and performance suffering and allowing a certain level of exposure during the year anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. So you want the mature animals to have immunity, so they have to be exposed to some worms to build that up. So
maybe just sticking with the basics, in terms of treatment, our treatment strategy for these lambs, how do we treat for parasites in Ireland?
So at the moment, the major strategy is suppressive treatment with antiparasitic or anthelminthic drugs. So there's a lot of different products on the market, but they all fall into one of 5 different classes. So there are 3 classes that everyone would be very familiar with. They've been around for a long time. These are the white drenches, the yellow drenches and the clear drenches, and they'd be the commonly used drenches on most sheep farms in Ireland. Now there are 2 other products that have recently come out on the market. There's an orange drench, which is Zolvix, or a purple drench, which is Startect, and both of these products are only available on veterinary prescription.
And that's probably why a lot haven't actually used them or seen them more commonly. They're not in our merchant stores.
They're not in your merchant stores. You can only get them from your vet. They tend to be a little bit more expensive as well, so they haven't been as widely used as the other products.
So I suppose just moving on from that, one of the issues we've talked about previously, and it's been on the radar for quite a while, is the whole issue of anthelmintic resistance to these actual products we're depending on to treat these worms. Maybe just firstly, could you explain what anthelmintic resistance is?
Yeah, so anthelmintic resistance is the ability of a worm to survive a dose that should have killed it. So when all of these products originally came out of the market, they were very, very effective and they killed all of the worms. Okay, but over time the worms have developed some resistance to the products. So what you find is that now some of the worms will survive. So we define resistance as when the dose kills less than 95% of the worms.
I suppose something just important to mention here, it's not a case of just turn up on the farm one day and all of a sudden you're resistant. It's not a no switch. It builds over time.
Absolutely, and I mean there's a whole kind of there can be a whole range from the drug is fully effective and it kills 100% of the worms, down to the drug isn't effective at all and it kills no worms, and everywhere in between. So, as I said, we define resistance as when less than 95% of the worms are killed. But at that point, the farmer is still seeing a benefit of using that drug. He's still killing the majority of the worms. The concern is that will continue to get worse and that, fewer and fewer worms will be killed over time. So when resistance develops, it's important that the further development of that resistance is slowed down.
And it's the worm that develops resistance. That's probably something else we don't clear.
Yes. So there's, I suppose this can get confused. with the sheep being resistant to the worms. But no, in this case, it is the worm which survives the treatment, survives the drug treatment.
And every generation they adapt more and more resistance becomes resistant.
Yeah, so what happens is it's actually a genetic mutation. So some worms develop a mutation that allows them to become resistant. When you treat, then that is selected for. So all the susceptible worms are killed, the resistant worms remain, and they contribute, then their offspring contribute to the next generation, and so resistance can build in that way.
I think that's something we might come back to later on in the conversation. Just how does resistance occur? How did this kick off on a farm?
Okay, so generally what happens is, it's a mutation, but then it is selected for. So there are certain types of uses of the drug that will lead to the development of resistance. So overusing products when they're not needed, that's one thing that will contribute. Not using a product correctly, so underdosing animals will contribute. Not calibrating the gun, all of those kind of things, and not using a product correctly can contribute to the development of resistance.
So a lot of these are kind of basic issues on farmers, essentially overexposure or incorrect exposure of the drugs to...
Absolutely, yes, okay. Yes, over-reliance on the drugs.
So, we just put this in context. Nationally, we've talked about our three groups that we depend on for most season: our whites, our yellows, and our ivermectins, or clears. What is the status of them nationally? How well are they working on our farms?
Okay, so white drench resistance has been known for a long time, and also yellow drench resistance. So the levels of white drench resistance are quite high. So it is important to point out now that we're still talking about the stomach worms.
So for nematodirus, that's separate.
So for nematodirus, it's a separate issue. The white drenches are still working. But for the stomach worms that you'd be worried about this time of year, we've known that there's been white and yellow drench resistance for some time. And the white drench resistance is quite widespread. Yellow drench resistance less so. But in the last few years, what we found is also found clear or drench or ivermectin resistance. And that was kind of quite a new finding in the last few years, and quite a concern, given that an awful lot of sheep farmers rely on ivermectin at this time of year.
It's probably the most commonly used product, your work, you looked at a lot of the results coming back from the STAP
yes.
Teagasc a couple of years ago, and that was probably one of the warning bells
that we found, that maybe on up to 20% of farms that there was an indication that the clear drenches, the ivermectin type drenches, were not working, which is a major concern.
I suppose just following from that, some of your more recent work, I know you've come back doing a more detailed study looking at, it's probably a little bit more stark, the results come from that it's confirmed there is actually...
Yes. Yeah, so we went out to a number of different sheep farms last year where we tested the efficacy of the white, yellow and the clear drenches. Now what we found is we found white drench resistance on all of the farms that we tested, but on about 45% of the farms we tested we also found ivermectin resistance.
So in certain cases, or a sizable proportion of our flocks out there now have more than one product now working. We call it multiple or double drench, or sometimes triple
drench resistance. Yes, we have identified a few flocks where none of the three commonly used products are working. So there is resistance to the white, yellow and the clear drenches.
So obviously that's going to pose a serious challenge for them farmers down the line. Maybe if we take a step back from that at the moment, look, the problem is obviously widespread and is quite serious, or will be quite serious in certain cases. How do we adapt our approach on farms? How do we prolong the products, or how should we appropriately treat, basically?
Okay, so again, there's a few kind of simple behaviours that can be implemented that will help prolong the life of the anthelminthic drugs that we have. So the first one is really to only dose when is needed. Okay, not to overuse the product. And so that just makes sure that when you're dosing, the animals need to be dosed, and make sure that you dose correctly. So make sure that the animals are not underdosed. So again, that the animals are weighed, that the dosing equipment is calibrated, and they're dosed to the weight of the heaviest animal in the group.
And obviously correct procedure when dosing, ensuring that you're correctly dosing the animal.
Yeah.
A lot of that is basic stuff. You mentioned there about only dosing when needed. I suppose the obvious signs we always look for here is lambs dirty, scouring lambs. They're the things we typically associate with worm burden. But to take that to the next step, how do you actually accurately identify? Because that might always be the best guess.
No, there can be lots of reasons why lambs are scarring, and it may not be worms. In a lot of cases, it isn't worms. So I suppose the best way to check whether lambs need dosing is to take a dung sample and to send it in for a fecal egg count. So we would normally say if the stomach worm egg count was around 600 eggs per gram, that would be the point at which the lambs would need to be dosed.
And I suppose it's just important that sample is from a representative group. It's not from individual one or two.
No,
lambs.
so usually from about 10 lambs in the group that you want to test. So take fecal samples from 10 different lambs within the group, and they are then pooled and an egg count done on the pooled sample. So and it is again important that they come from lambs. And
that's within a management group?
Within a management group, within a grazing group, yeah.
There are a number of approved veterinary labs out there now that can test for that.
There are.
So that's one strategy. And the other couple of points are very relevant. They're simple, practical things we can do on farm. I suppose the other concept that comes up, and I've heard it mentioned quite a bit when we're talking about resistance and prolonging the lifespan of drugs, is the whole area of refugia.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So maybe we'll explain, like, when we treat a lamb, we're treating the parasites that's in that lamb.
Yes.
But there are other worms or other parasites there in other sheep and on pasture.
Absolutely.
What is refugia?
So refugia is any parasite that isn't exposed to the drug. So again, that will be the parasites on pasture, and actually most of the parasites on the farm will be the parasites on the pasture usually rather than in the animal. Okay, so you've got a large number of parasites on the pasture that aren't exposed to the drug. You've also got parasites in animals that aren't treated. So these are, in your yos or maybe in heavier lambs that are coming close to being drafted aren't being dosed. So the parasites, all of those parasites that aren't exposed to the drug, they're the refugia population.
And I suppose I can ask the basic one again, but why is that important?
So why is that important is because they dilute any resistant worms. So what happens is if you treat the animals with a drug, all of the susceptible worms are killed and only the resistant worms survive. They then get passed out in the dung, out onto pasture, and they contribute their genes to the next generation. So if they go out onto a pasture and they're very, very heavily diluted by susceptible worms that haven't been exposed to the drug, that limits the amount of resistance in the next generation of worms.
Because this came up earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the worms actually breed. So
yes.
The resistant worms are the ones that survive the drench.
Yes.
And they then become a larger proportion of that population.
They pass those genes for resistance onto their offspring, and so the next generation of worms will be more resistant unless they're diluted out by susceptible worms in refugia.
So in reality, we do need to change our mindset slightly. Of course, best practice should always apply, but we need to consider managing refugia or how we control in pasture. So I'm thinking two key areas that probably were thrown out previously. One was dose and move to clean ground, which
has production, has
yes,
performance
certainly.
Benefits, but it's not very sustainable in terms of anthelmintic use, because what happens is then any resistant worms go out onto relatively clean pasture, and that pasture can get contaminated with resistant worms reasonably quickly. So in terms of slowing the development of anthelmintic resistance, it's not best practice.
And then the other one that will frequently crop up is the whole area of dosing yos.
Yeah, again,
so, there's been pros and cons to why that was done, but I suppose our current mindset on it at the moment. So
I mean, as I mentioned, most sheep develop immunity to worms relatively quickly. So usually within about by the time they're about a year old or so, they've developed reasonable immunity to worms. So in general, mature yos do not need to be dosed. The one kind of exception you might have is if you're breeding yo lambs at lambing, they may need a dose because they will be under a little bit more pressure.
That's the 1-year-old yo. She's lactating and she's also grown, so that immunity is challenged. That's quite a challenge for her. She's under a little bit more pressure, so she may need a dose. But in general, mature yos should have good immunity and should not need to be dosed. With very few exceptions, maybe it's by and large that practice needs to stop because that is
they're a great source of refugia.
So I suppose just maybe go back on one aspect of it. how could we test for resistance? How do we know a product is working? How do you check it's product working?
Okay, so as I mentioned there, in general, when these drugs are effective, they should kill all of the worms. So really, to test if a product is working, what you need to do is you need to take a dung sample and send it for analysis to determine the number of worm eggs in the dung, the fecal egg count. And you need to do that before you dose. You then need to take a second sample after you've dosed. Now, ideally, what you should see is that there should be no eggs in the second sample after dosing. If that dose works, it should have killed all of the worms and there should be no eggs in that second sample. When you take the sample, the second sample will depend on the drug that you've used. So it's 1 week later for a yellow product or 2 weeks later for a white or a clear product.
Okay, so that is 2 weeks post-dose. Take the sample at dosing. You get the initial worm count and either 7 days for yellow or 14 for white and clear.
Yeah, and what you would expect to see with the second sample is that there are no eggs, that all of the worms have been killed, or that the reduction in the egg count is greater than 95%.
Okay. So checking is certainly important. We know where you stand.
Absolutely. I mean, you need to know that the product that you're using is working and that it is killing the worms.
And our approach after that, like we mentioned earlier, there are farms with double resistance, with triple resistance. In essence, that is nearly a case-by-case basis because it's not always the same.
Absolutely. So I think it's very important for them to know what is working or what isn't working, and again, to know the extent of the resistance. Is it killing any worms? Is it killing only very few worms? And then I think again, really need to have a chat with their advisor or their vet about designing a worm control plan that is tailored to their farm, given the unique situation that they're in.
Because ultimately it will impact on performance when it gets to a certain level, and if you don't address it,
absolutely,
it'll only get worse.
Yes, yeah. Resistance will further develop.
I suppose the other concept of this is if you don't have a problem, it's like a lot of things, you don't want to buy one in. The whole area of biosecurity. I'm thinking at this time of year, rams are coming on farms, breeding hoggets, in certain cases store lambs. You can bring in resistance.
Absolutely, and I suppose this is something to be very aware of now. As we just mentioned, in the last few years we're starting to see ivermectin resistance. So in the past, people may be dosed, if they had a biosecurity protocol, they may be dosed animals they bought in with ivermectin. However, we now know that ivermectin resistance is out there. So really, for bought-in animals, you need to be treating them with one of the two new products, the Zolvix or the StarTect. They are very new products. There has been no resistance reported to those products in Ireland. So they are the best guarantee that you will have of making sure that you kill all of the worms and that you don't buy in resistant worms onto your farm.
Okay, and then when you do land in, turn them out to dirty pasture.
Turn them out to dirty pasture so that they pick up the worms from your farm.
Okay. Look, I think we've covered a lot of aspects and we could probably discuss this for another hour in more detail, but maybe if you could just summarise a couple of key points that we need to consider.
Okay, so in terms of a sustainable worm control strategy, there's a few kind of things to bear in mind. So the first one is when you're dosing, know what product you're using. So know what group it belongs to. As I mentioned, most of the products that we're buying belong to the white, yellow or clear group. So know what product you're using. Check the dosing equipment, so make sure when you dose correctly, that you're using good technique, the equipment is calibrated, you're dosing to the weight of the heaviest animals. Check the efficacy. So occasionally, maybe once per year or so, check for the products that you're using, check that they're working. So do a fecal egg count after you've dosed to check that the product has worked. Avoid dosing animals and moving to clean pasture because this selects for anthelmintic resistance, and I suppose don't blanket dose yos.
Okay. Orla, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kieran.
A lot of good basic points I think in that, and look, we might catch up again with you later on. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Kieran.
We're going to finish up at this point. I would like to thank Orla for taking the time out to join us and offer our insights in this area. It's clearly an ever-evolving topic, and as an industry we face a challenge of dealing with resistance. I think Orla provided some excellent advice on how we can start to address this issue and improve management practice at farm level. There is more information available on this topic on the sheep section of the Teagasc website. Again, for all further updates, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us in this episode of Ovicast. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on the next episode.